the so-called Aryan Councils. Now, as far as I understand, during the reign of Constantine, there were some so-called Aryan Councils, that is, people who were against what became the co-equality of the Son with the Father and so on, the early Trinitarian theology. So there were some under Constantine, but it looks to me like it picked up these councils against Nicaea with Constantius. So can you tell us a little bit about the councils, perhaps around how many councils were there and in your estimation? And then I'll ask you about what you call the huge joint council known as Rimini.
Well, I mean, first let's understand that a council, I mean, it may seem now to be, these days it's a very unusual thing for there to be a council. There'll be like the Vatican Council, for example, in the Catholic Church. But in those days, a council was the way, I don't know if it was as common as a Zoom meeting. A council was a way in which, if you were going to get together with other people and talk about what you believed and talk about policy issues, and even also talk about practical issues, that the council was the way to do it. So people would have councils that were local. Whatever country you were in that it would have a church, if it had a few churches, the churches would get together. Their officials would get together every now and then and say, look, we have to work out this problem. And a lot of times, as I said, the problems that they were working out were purely practical. What was unusual was to have the councils that were called ecumenical. That is councils where people would reach out beyond your own locality and beyond your own region and try to bring in people from a wide variety of regions to try to talk about problems that were thought to be important. So there were many local councils before Constantius. There was one, the Council of Nicaea was an ecumenical council at least in name, although really almost all of the people who came to Nicaea were from the east, part of the Roman Empire. Under Constantius, however, there were at least 9 important ecumenical councils. When you look back at those councils and what happened at them, they're absolutely fascinating reading, but also exciting things about them and saddening things about them. The councils under Constantius were really attempts mainly in the direction of what conservative Arianism. They were attempts to get people who had been at Nicaea or who thought the Nicene rules weren't that bad to find some basis on which to agree with people who didn't like the Nicene rules very much, to try to find some consensus that we could all agree that, the following issues are important and the following issues are not important. We could all agree, in particular, that Jesus Christ was a uniquely holy person, in many ways like God, but who is not actually God. That he was still separate from God and in some ways inferior. Under Constantius, the conservative Arians thought it can't be that difficult to get people to agree that, especially if you think about the times that we're talking about, the Father and Son, that the Father is always superior to the Son. And the Father's the Father. But the Son, it isn't just any Son, it's the Son of God. So why can't we agree that Jesus is the person in history who we would most want to be like? Jesus is the person in history who has powers that most people couldn't dream of having, and all of that. But we can do that without saying he is identical with God. Because if we say he's identical with God, we have all kinds of problems. And then we have 2 gods. And they desperately thought that they could find a kind of reasonable way to get all Christians to agree. And the tragedy was that they couldn't, that people were already so committed to the idea that Jesus and God were identical, that for them was the basis of the creation of a new religion that would definitively separate itself not only from paganism, but from Judaism. It just was not going to work. It looked as though it was going to work, and it looked as though it was going to work, especially after Rimini Seleucia, the conference that you mentioned before. I mean, there were these 9 meetings involving a lot of bishops and a lot of priests. Even Hosius of Cordova finally signed on to one of these formulas saying that Jesus and God were really similar, although not identical. But in Rimini Seleucia, which was the most ecumenical council ever held, close to 600 bishops, 500 and something bishops. They're from both East and West. It was held in two different places. Rimini is on the Adriatic coast of Italy, and Seleucia is in Turkey. They arrived at a what looks as though it's a perfectly reasonable compromise. In the wake of it, Saint Jerome in Palestine said the world awoke as if after a drunken party to find itself Arian. Horrifying to Jerome that the identity of Jesus and God had been questioned. So that's where the split occurred. I have to say that if you look at these councils as I do from the perspective of conflict resolution, which is what I teach, the kind of tragedy of it is that people are looking for a formula. They're kind of looking for words that will somehow resolve a conflict. And the idea is if we can find the right words, we can get everybody to agree to this. But ever since that was the problem with Nicaea to begin with, you would have to try to find out why people disagreed so strongly about what seems in retrospect in some ways to be, to some people is not that important a difference. Although I think actually it is an important difference. You look and you say, well, why can't they agree on some words? Well, of course, I think the answer is that in some cases, words just don't do it. You have to talk about what really divides you. Why do the people who want Jesus to be identical to God, why do they feel so strongly about it? What exactly is the problem?
Right. And it's interesting what you say about both groups really trying to find, I think you talk about it in your book, a new theological language, a new sort of vocabulary. And it says a lot about their ideas back then of what became known as the sufficiency of Scripture. So I guess the Scriptures were not sufficient enough. Let me ask you about this council at Rimini, Arminium. Let me ask you about the creed they come up with, because it's a very interesting so-called creed. It's also known, as you know, as the dated creed. That's because, as you say in your book, this was the only dated creed. In other words, they dated it specific to May 22nd, 359 AD. And it says in part, since the term essence, ousia in Greek, was adopted by the fathers at Nicaea without proper reflection or naively, and not being known by the people causes offense because the scriptures do not contain it, it has been resolved that it should be removed, and that in future there should be no mention whatever of essence in regard to God, since the divine scriptures nowhere refer to essence when speaking about Father and Son. But we declare that the Son is like the Father in all things, as the Holy Scriptures indeed declare and teach. Now, this is a rather, I would think, Professor, devastating early creed. I don't think many people know about. What does it say about Nicaea? And I always hear this, Professor, that these issues of the Trinity and was Jesus God, to this day, I hear a lot of theologians and evangelicals and Catholics and so on say that, look, it's settled matter. It was settled back in 325. But here we have a creed from 359. It doesn't sound to me like it was quite settled, or even to this day. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, that's such an interesting question. No, it's not. What the dated creed says is that the way they solved this problem was to kind of go outside of Scripture, go outside of Hebrew, go outside of both Jewish and Christian philosophy at that point, and go and find a term in Greek, homoousios, that could kind of express the identity that they were arguing for, the identity between Jesus and God. I mean, you have to say, I guess, since the Athanasians, the Nicaeans won that debate, at least they got state power to enforce it after Theodosius became emperor. Settled it for a while. It settled it for quite a long time. But one thing about these questions is that they don't stay settled. If it's a real question, you can declare whatever you like and say it now it's law, but they don't stay settled. And this question came totally undone again in the modern period of all things. I mean, starting with the 17th century. And as you probably know, Sir Isaac Newton was an Arian. I mean, it seemed to be settled, but it didn't stay settled just because people said it was settled. It's another illustration of the fact that the right word doesn't settle a dispute like this.